Nshira followed Obadil into the darkness, her heart pounding with every step. The baobab tree stood tall behind them, its roots reaching deep into the earth like the fingers of ancient spirits. Ahead, the land sloped downward into the forest. A forest unlike any she had ever seen. The trees here were old, older than the villages, older than the kingdoms, older than time itself. Their trunks twisted like the bodies of sleeping giants, their branches stretched towards the heavens, whispering secrets to the wind. It was a place of power. A place where the gods once walked, before men had forgotten them. Obadil moved swiftly, his feet barely making a sound against the damp earth. Nshira struggled to keep up, her body aching from days of suffering. But she knew she could not stop. Behind her, in the distance, she could already hear it, the sound of hunters. Akong's men were moving. Closer. Where are we going? Nshira asked, breathless. Obadil did not turn. To a place where even the hunters will fear to follow. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, a warning. They pushed deeper into the woods, and with each step, the air grew heavier. Thicker. It felt as though unseen hands were pressing against Nshira's skin, watching her, testing her. Then, suddenly, a whisper. Turn back. Nshira froze. It came from the trees, from the shadows, from the very air around them. A chorus of voices, soft and mournful. Turn back, child of the sea. Nshira's blood ran cold. Who is speaking? She whispered. Obadil's pace did not slow. The forgotten ones. Nshira shivered. She had heard stories of the old gods, the deities abandoned by men. Without worship, they had faded into shadows, left to wander places like this, half alive, half dead, waiting. Why do they warn me? She asked. Obadil glanced at her. Because they know what lies ahead. Nshira swallowed. And what is that? Obadil did not answer. But he did not have to. The trees parted suddenly, revealing a clearing. And in its center stood something terrible. A shrine, but not a shrine for men. It was made of bones. Thousands of bones. Twisted together, forming a towering structure that pulsed with an energy Nshira could not name. The wind howled through its hollow spaces, carrying whispers of sorrow. Nshira stepped back. What is this place? Obadil exhaled slowly. The last temple of the forgotten gods. Nshira felt her skin crawl. Why did you bring me here? Obadil's eyes gleamed in the darkness. Because this is the only place where a man like Akong will not dare to follow. Far behind them, at the edge of the forest, the hunters hesitated. They had followed Nshira's trail without fear, until now. Now, standing at the mouth of the woods, they could feel it. The spirits. The old ones. The forgotten ones. One of the men swallowed hard. This is cursed land. Akong's face twisted with impatience. Cowards. She is just a woman. One of the hunters, an older man with scarred arms, stepped forward. His expression was grim. This land does not belong to men. It belongs to those who were abandoned. Akong's jaw tightened. Then we will not disturb them. We will move quickly. But the old hunter shook his head. The moment we enter, we are already seen. Akong hated this. He had spent too long planning, waiting, dreaming of the fortune that would be his. He would not lose now, not to spirits, not to fear. But the men were right. This was not ordinary land. This was a place where even the living could become lost. And so, reluctantly, he made a decision. We will wait, he said. She cannot stay in there forever. And so the hunters set up camp at the forest's edge, their eyes fixed on the darkness. Waiting. Watching. For Nshira to make a mistake. Nshira stood frozen before the shine of bones, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. The air around her was thick with whispers, as though unseen mouths pressed against her ears, speaking in tongues she could not understand. Obadil, however, remained unmoved. He stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the shrine with an unreadable expression. "This is the only place Akong will not dare to enter," he had said. Now, standing here, surrounded by the weight of the forgotten ones, Nshira finally understood why. Something watched them. Something ancient. She could feel it, pressing against her spirit, coiling around her like mist. A presence. A hunger. And then, a voice. "You dare step into our domain, child of the sea." The words did not come from a single direction. They came from everywhere. Nshira's knees nearly buckled. Before her, the shrine seemed to shift, the bones twisting, the shadows lengthening, taking shape. A form began to emerge, pulling itself from the darkness of the temple. It was not human. Its body was fluid, constantly changing, one moment a towering figure of bone, the next, a twisting coil of smoke. Its face was a shifting mask, sometimes a skull, sometimes a faceless void. Obadil exhaled sharply. "You have been asleep for a long time," he murmured. The entity laughed. "Time is nothing to us, trickster. But we remember you." Obadil stiffened. Nshira's breath caught. He had said he was a wanderer. A man who walked between realms. But what was he, truly? The entity turned its hollow gaze to Nshira. "And you, reek of the sea. Why have you come?" Nshira's throat was dry. "I seek safety." The entity tilted its shifting head. "Safety." A cold gust of wind swept through the clearing. The whispers of the forgotten ones grew louder, their voices layered, tangled, endless. No one is safe in a world that has forgotten its gods. Nshira forced herself to stay firm. "The man who seeks me, he is waiting beyond the forest. If I leave, he will take me back, and he will hurt me." The shadows rippled. Ah, the greed of men. Always taking, always consuming. The air turned colder. The entity moved, circling her like a predator, considering its prey. "And if we were to protect you, little one, what would you give us in return?" Nshira hesitated. "I have nothing to give." The laughter that followed was a terrible sound, low, rattling, like bones scraping together in a pit. "Foolish girl. Everything has a price." Nshira's stomach tightened. What do you want?" The shadows stilled. Then, in a voice like thunder, the forgotten one spoke. "A single tear." Nshira's heart stopped. Her body tensed, every muscle locking in place. A tear. Did they know? Did they know what her tears could do? Before she could answer, Obadil stepped forward. "No," he said sharply. "You cannot take that from her." The shadows turned toward him. "You speak for her now, trickster." Obadil's jaw clenched. "You know what her tears hold. If she gives you one, you will never let her go." The entity grinned, a wide, skeletal grin that stretched too far. "You still remember our ways, don't you?" Obadil's fists tightened. Nshira turned to him, confusion flooding her mind. "What are they talking about?" He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the entity, his face grim. Then, the forgotten one leaned forward, towering over Nshira. "One tear, child of the sea. One pearl. Give it to us, and we will shield you from your hunter." Nshira's pulse pounded in her ears. If she gave them her tear, would she ever be free? At the edge of the forest, Bakong's patience was wearing thin. The night had stretched long, but still, there was no sign of Nshira. One of the hunters shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should leave her." Akong turned on him, his face twisting with fury. "Leave her," he spat. "She is my wife." The hunter's face darkened. "She is a woman who does not wish to be owned." Akong struck him. The man stumbled back, wiping blood from his lip, but he said nothing more. Akong breathed heavily. His hands were shaking, not from exhaustion, but from rage. She thought she could escape him. She thought she could run. "I will have her back," he thought. "And she will cry for me, whether she wants to or not." Then, from the depths of the forest, a sound rose. A sound that made the hunter's blood run cold. A low, echoing laugh. It carried through the trees like the wailing of the dead, thick with ancient power. One by one, the hunters stepped back. Akong's skin prickled with unease. He had had many things in his life. But never had he had laughter like that. The forest had awoken. And something was answering his hunt. The silence after the Forgotten One's demand was heavy. Nshira's body tensed, her heart hammering against her ribs. One tear. That was all they wanted. But she knew better. Her tears were not like those of ordinary women. They carried power. They brought fortune to men and misfortune to herself. Every tear she had shed in suffering had only fed the greed of those who sought her. And now, these ancient beings, these forgotten ones, were asking for the same thing. Would she trade one prison for another? Beside her, Abadil stood rigid. His gaze was fixed on the shifting entity before them, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. A sign of unease. "You do not have to do this," he murmured. The shadows rippled with laughter. "Oh, but she does." The bones of the shrine rattled as if something within them was stirring. The whispers in the air became a chorus, pleading, taunting, waiting. "We can keep you safe, child of the sea. But all things must be paid for. If not a tear, then something else." Nshira swallowed hard. "What else do you want?" The entity stilled. Then, in a voice like the rumbling of distant thunder, it answered. "Your voice." A shudder ran through her. Her voice. She was silent for a long moment, gripping her hands together to still their trembling. If she lost her voice, she could no longer tell her story. She could no longer fight for herself. She had already spent too long being powerless. "No," she whispered. "I will give you neither my tear nor my voice." The forest groaned. The very air around them shifted. The Forgotten Ones did not take rejection lightly. "Foolish girl," the entity hissed. "Do you think men will not take from you anyway?" Nshira's fingers curled into fists. "Then let them try," she said, still laced in her voice. For a moment the shadows did not move. Then, a strange thing happened. The entity laughed. It was a slow, eerie sound, rattling like wind through dry leaves. The shadows withdrew slightly, rippling as if amused. "Very well," the Forgotten One murmured. "We will not take. But we will still offer." Nshira blinked in confusion. "Offer?" The entity's form flickered between shadow and bone. "A gift for your defiance." Abadil tensed. "No. She does not need your gifts." But the entity ignored him. The shrine of bones trembled, and from within its depths, something emerged. A single black pearl. It hovered before Nshira, dark as the midnight sea, its surface shimmering with an eerie glow. "Take it, child of the sea." The voices of the Forgotten Ones curled around her ears. "It may yet save you." Nshira hesitated. Obadil's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Do not," he warned, his voice low. She looked up at him, searching his face. There was something in his expression that unsettled her, fear. But before she could decide, the wind shifted. And in the distance, a horn blew. At the edge of the forest, Akong had grown impatient. The laughter in the woods had unsettled his men, and for hours they had refused to enter. But Akong was done waiting. "We move now," he ordered, his voice edged with fury. One of the hunters hesitated. "But the spirits." Akong turned on him, his face twisted with rage. "Spirits do not spend my cowries," he snapped. "She is in there, and she is mine. I will not let some forgotten ghosts keep me from my fortune." With that, he stepped forward into the trees. For a brief moment, the other hunters did not move. Then, grudgingly, one by one, they followed. The forest swallowed them whole. And just like that, the true hunt had begun. Nshira's chest tightened. "They are coming," she whispered. Obadil cursed under his breath. His grip on her wrist tightened for a fraction of a second before he let go. "Then we must move. Now." But the black pearl still hovered before her. "Take it," the whispers urged. "You will need it before the end." Nshira hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached out. Obadil closed his eyes, as if he already knew it was useless to stop her. Her fingers closed around the pearl. And the moment she did, everything changed. The forest around them shuddered, as if the trees themselves had gasped. A sharp wind howled through the clearing, making the shrine of bones rattle violently. The forgotten ones laughed. And in the distance, where the hunters moved through the trees, the first of them suddenly screamed. A single scream shattered the silence of the forest. It was raw, filled with terror, a sound that did not belong to the world of the living. Nshira stiffened, her fingers tightening around the black pearl. Beside her, Obadil cursed, his body tensed like a man preparing for war. The shadows around them stirred. "And so it begins," the forgotten ones whispered. Their laughter slithered through the air, thick with amusement. Nshira's pulse raced. "What is happening?" Obadil grabbed her hand. "No time. We run." He pulled her forward, deeper into the trees, his movements swift and precise. The ground beneath them was soft with ancient moss, swallowing the sound of their footsteps. But behind them, the forest was awakening. Akong did not slow his steps, despite the scream that had echoed through the trees. He would not be swayed by fear. Fools, he thought bitterly. Grown men, frightened by shadows. The hunter who had screamed was nowhere to be seen. Vanished. One moment he had been there, walking beside them, and the next, gone. The remaining hunters shifted uneasily. "We should turn back," one of them muttered. Akong shot him a glare. "You can turn back if you like. But I will find her, alone if I must." The hunter swallowed hard, but he said nothing more. Still, the forest felt different now. The air was thick, heavy, like walking through unseen hands pressing against their skin. Shadows stretched unnaturally long. The trees seemed to breathe. Then, a rustle. Akong's hand went to his sword. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, a voice. "You should not have come." It was not Nshira. It was not anyone. The voice came from the trees. Akong's breath quickened. His grip tightened around his weapon. "Show yourself." A chuckle. Then, movement. Something crawled from the shadows. It was not human. The thing that emerged had the shape of a man, but its body was wrong. Its arms were too long, its fingers thin like the legs of a spider. Its skin was dark as the void, shifting as though it was made of living shadow. Its face was the worst part. It had no eyes. No nose. Just a wide, grinning mouth. Akong took a step back. The creature tilted its head. Then, with a sound like the tearing of fabric, it moved. Nshira and Obadil ran, weaving between trees as the cries of the hunters filled the night. One by one, they fell. Some were swallowed by the shadows, their voices cutting off in choked gasps. Others ran blindly, only to find the trees shifting around them, twisting their paths into a maze with no exit. The forest was alive. And it was hungry. But Akong did not fall. He fought. His blade sang through the air, slicing into the creatures that tried to take him. His fury burned brighter than fear. He would not live without Nshira. He could not. Not after coming this far. Then, through the chaos, he saw something. A shimmer. A faint glow deeper into the trees. He knew that glow. He had seen it before, on her face. Nshira. Ignoring the horrors around him, he pushed forward, toward the light. Toward her. Nshira felt the pearl grow warm in her hand. Something about it pulled at her. The forest around them groaned, the cries of the hunters fading into silence. The trees shifted, opening a path that had not been there before. Obadil slowed. This is wrong. Nshira swallowed. It's leading me somewhere. Obadil's jaw tightened. Or leading something to you. She hesitated. But then, she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Determined. Coming toward them. Obadil turned. His eyes darkened. His ear. Nshira's blood went cold. She knew who it was. Akong had not been lost. He had not been taken. He had found her. And he would never stop. The pearl in her palm pulsed. For the first time, Nshira wondered. What did I just take? The night was thick with tension. The air hung heavy, charged with something unseen but felt deep in the bones. The cries of the hunters had faded, swallowed by the vengeful forest. Only one set of footsteps remained. Akong was coming. Nshira's fingers clenched around the black pearl. It pulsed in her palm, as though alive, as though it knew the storm that approached. Beside her, Obadil's body was rigid, his hand hovering over the hilt of his knife. His usually unreadable face was set in a grim scowl. We should go. His voice was low, urgent. Now. But Nshira couldn't move. The trees had shifted again, creating a clearing bathed in silver moonlight. The ground was covered in soft grass, untouched by time. In the center, an ancient stone altar rose, cracked and weathered, whispering of forgotten prayers and lost gods. The pearl had led her here. Why? The answer came with the sound of branches snapping. A dark figure emerged from the trees. Akong. His clothes were torn, smeared with dirt and blood, not his own. His eyes were wild, gleaming like a beast backed into a corner. And when he saw her, standing in the moonlight, something in him broke. Nshira. He breathed her name like a dying man gasping for air. His fingers tightened around his sword, not in threat, but in desperation. You ran from me, he said, voice hoarse with exhaustion and anger. Do you know what I have been through to find you? Nshira took a step back. You should not have followed. His face twisted. You don't belong out here, lost in this cursed forest. You belong with me. Obadil moved slightly, stepping between them. She belongs to no one. Akong's gaze snapped to him. His lip curled in disgust. And you, he sneered. The wandering liar. Do you think I don't know what you are? Obadil remained unfazed. Oh. And what am I? A snake, Akong spat. A man who slithers between stories, whispering lies to women so they trust you. So they follow you. His eyes darkened. But she is mine. Obadil let out a low chuckle. If she were yours, you would not have to hunt her like a beast in the night. Akong's rage ignited. With a roar, he lunged. His sword sang through the air, aimed straight for Obadil's chest. But the trickster was faster. With the ease of a man who had danced with death 1,000 times, Obadil stepped aside, twisting just enough to let the blade slice through empty air. Akong stumbled forward, his own momentum nearly sending him to the ground. But he recovered, spinning back, blade raised. This was no clumsy nobleman wielding a weapon for show. Akong was a warrior. And he was deadly. Nshira's heart pounded. The pearl in her hand burned now, as though reacting to the battle unfolding before her. What are you? She thought desperately. What power do you hold? She didn't know. But she had a feeling she would find out soon. Obadil dodged another strike, moving like wind through the trees. His dagger flashed in the moonlight, quick as lightning. For a moment, they circled each other. Hunter and hunted. Predator and trickster. Then, Akong did something unexpected. He dropped his sword. Obadil hesitated just for a second. And in that second, Akong struck. With the speed of a serpent, he closed the distance, slamming into Obadil's chest. The impact sent them both crashing to the ground, rolling through the grass. Fists, elbows, knees, they fought like men who knew no mercy. And then, Akong's hands found Obadil's throat. Nshira's breath caught. Obadil struggled, his fingers clawing at Akong's iron grip. His face darkened, breath choking. Akong leaned close, his voice a snarl. You are nothing but a man who plays with gods. But I am no fool. I will take what is mine. Then, his gaze snapped to Nshira. Give me a tear, he demanded. Nshira froze. Akong's grip on Obadil's throat tightened. Or I will kill him. The night stood still. The forest watched. Nshira's fingers dug into the pearl. Her mind raced. She could not cry. She would not. Obadil's body twitched, his struggles weakening. Think, Nshira. Think. Her gaze flickered to the pearl. It had led her here. It had burned in her palm. It was no ordinary thing. And perhaps it was never meant to be given. Perhaps it was meant to be used. Akong's fingers tightened. Obadil's body jerked. No more. Nshira made her decision. With a single motion, she crushed the pearl. The world exploded. A burst of black light erupted from her palm, expanding outward like a tidal wave. Akong was thrown backward, his body colliding with the stone altar, his scream lost in the chaos. Obadil gasped, pulling in a desperate breath as the force flung him away from his captor. The air rippled, thick with magic. The trees bowed, whispering in voices older than time. And in the heart of it all, Nshira stood, transformed. Her eyes, once dark, now glowed like the depths of the ocean. Her skin shimmered, taking on a faint iridescence. The power of the forgotten ones, the power of the sea, coursed through her veins. She felt limitless. And Akong was afraid. For the first time, the man who had hunted her, controlled her, sought to break her, looked at her and knew fear. Nshira stepped forward. Akong scrambled back, pressing against the altar. Nshira, he gasped. Wait. But she did not stop. For the first time, she saw him as he was. Not a man. Not a god. Just another greedy soul, terrified of losing his prize. You want my power, she whispered. The wind howled in response. Akong shook his head, his body trembling. You will have nothing. She lifted her hand, and the forest answered. Dark tendrils rose from the ground, curling around Akong's limbs. He screamed. The vines dragged him downward, into the waiting earth. Into the hungry roots of the forest that had already taken his men. Akong begged. He cursed. He fought. But the forest does not return what it has claimed. And then, he was gone. Swallowed whole. The night fell silent. Obadil, still catching his breath, looked at Nshira. "Remind me," he said hoarsely. "To never make you angry." Nshira exhaled. Her power settled, fading but not disappearing. For the first time, she was truly free. But her journey was not over. It had only just begun.